Right, welcome to the meeting. I'm very glad to see such a big turnout. Obviously, it's an extremely important session. My name's Bob Sulatycki. I'm from the West London Socialist Party, and we're going to have two speakers today. Paul Kershaw, who's the chair of Unite, the London housing branch of Unite, which has been very involved with the aftermath of Grenfell, and Nancy Taaffe from the Waltham Forest Socialist Party, who's been a very active housing campaigner in East London and was involved with the Butterfields campaign. I would say that we were hoping we would get, although we didn't bill it, we were hoping that Stuart, who is a survivor in fact, and a witness to Grenfell, would also, he might still make it, but he tried to make it, to speak to us, and he's been extremely active in the campaign, actually from the night, in organising relief. But like many of the survivors, and he's quite open about it, he's had terrible mental health issues from witnessing friends of his screaming for help and being unable to help, and he said that it was a possibility that he wouldn't come because he gets flashbacks when he talks about it. So, and it shows you, and that, by the way, I should say, is not uncommon amongst the community on the Lancaster West estate. So, but it does point to the fact, I think, not just actually the tragedy that occurred, and it wasn't a simple tragedy. It was, in our view, it was murder. It was something that was foreseen, it was something that was warned about, and yet the richest council in Europe ignored its own citizens because they were working class citizens in a community that they've always neglected. And not only did they ignore the warnings, as we saw in the immediate aftermath of the fire, they were unable to mount any kind of relief campaign for the victims and for the survivors. It was left up to the local working class community to do that by themselves, not just on the first day, but for weeks. It was absolutely appalling. We went down on the second day, and there wasn't even not even a photocopied sheet on lampposts saying contact this number for the council, and that went on for days and for days, and it encapsulates everything that's wrong with British capitalism. The whole episode, the run up to the fire, the warnings that were ignored, the fire itself, and then the aftermath. And I think one of the points that Stuart was going to make, a very important point, is that despite the big PR effort by the state, that none of those issues for the victims have been dealt with yet. All those questions about for the victims about rehousing, about financial support, about psychological support, none of them. You get the inquiry. You get the impression, no, they've all been sorted, and they push it on the back burner. But in fact, they're live issues. It isn't something that's just a historical record. Now, I'm raising that because I know that Stuart was going to raise that and talk about the ongoing campaign, the tenets of which he's a part. And I should say, by the way, he might come, and I don't want to embarrass him, but he and the team around him on that estate have played an absolutely heroic role, actually, and have been slandered that by sections of the press and by the media. And they've received no help either from the council or from the government, or actually, in his case, from their employers. And we know Stuart very well because Stuart is an excellent trade union activist and a member and a steward in Paul's housing branch. So there are a lot of issues, not just over Grenfell, because this is also an opportunity at the weekend to discuss general issues about, obviously Grenfell's connected with, that face us on the issue of housing. So without any further ado, I'm going to ask Paul to introduce the subject, and Paul will have 15 minutes or so.
Well, comrades, I think it doesn't need spelling out that the fire at Grenfell Tower was a really profoundly shocking event for all of us watching it, particularly if you live opposite it, as Bob was outlining. And I think that subsequently it really encapsulates particularly sharply the political issues in Britain. And in many ways the value of this session is not only to note how terrible the events were, but what lessons we can draw from it and what actions we can take. Now, as Bob said, particularly sharp for members of the Unite Housing branch and people that work in the sector, because we organise housing managers and we fought against the cuts and attacks on social housing, and in many ways, maybe I'll show a bit in the discussion, this sort of indicates the warnings that have been given. We also organise people actually in the housing regulator, and I think points may come out in the discussion on that, but this does take place in the context of the bonfire of red tape and so on, of getting rid of regulations. But housing workers themselves have to live somewhere, and our members have been, particularly in London, affected really acutely by the housing crisis, and it is brought out by the case of Stuart, whose life has been completely disrupted in the months since the fire, who, as Stuart said, as Bob said, was a stalwart really of the branch, a health and safety rep for a long period of time, and his own employer have been, who are a social housing employer, have been, to say the least, less than sympathetic within it. So particularly in that way, it does encapsulate for our members the struggles that they're involved in. And I think one of the more ludicrous responses of the Tories and the government is to say, don't politicise this. This is just a tragedy, as if it's a sort of natural phenomena. Don't politicise it. And actually, that's untrue that you can depoliticise it for fires in general. Because actually, if you project a map of fire deaths in Britain or internationally, and a map of poverty, the two completely overlap. Actually, fire deaths and risk from fire is, in general, a class issue. But it was also really seen as a political issue, I think, by the immediate community. And in fact, that came home to me particularly clearly because I think Bob, John Viner, who's not here, and me were probably we're certainly the first people who arrived with political leaflets at the demonstration that took place the week of the fire outside the town hall. And in fact, some people went into the town hall, and that was presented as storming the town hall. But actually, it was the only way they could get to talk to anyone from the council was to storm the town hall. And I think we didn't really know what response. I didn't think it would be a hostile response, but we didn't know what response because we went with very directly political leaflets raising, the role of the Tories, the role of Jeremy Corbyn, and broader political demands. And they were the leaflets were people literally were queuing up to take the leaflets from it. And so it was clear that that community saw this as a political issue and particularly identified actually the role of Corbyn and the left fighting, they saw as a left fighting leadership of Labour, and in particular the demand to requisition empty houses in that borough, because it's a phenomenally wealthy area, and particularly actually the town hall just off Kensington High Street. You really wouldn't need to explain the class nature of British society. You just stand there and you see it. And that is a significant point because Jeremy Corbyn raising that demand had a massive effect, and you could really see in the actually disciplined anger of that crowd that unleashed what could be an unstoppable force in British society. I mean, I think, a few weeks later, I went from the Unite Housing branch to a Labour Party meeting in Kensington. And that was a meeting full of, actually, you could say a representative mix of the people in Kensington, because a lot of the suits in the meeting were extremely expensive, both ends. I was invited by a Unite branch secretary. And the mood, people were very sympathetic, but it was a completely different mood, actually. And so if you want to understand the strength of the movement behind Corbyn, it is partly the mood of people within the Labour Party, but it's a completely different feeling and completely different set of people on that demonstration outside. And I think that demand, Bob mentioned how really very little has been done for the people involved. I think that demand for requisitioning, it was, sidelined really after that, should be put right back at the top of the agenda, shouldn't it? Because we're coming up to Christmas and there's still people living in hotels with their kids and so on in a borough with just a mass of homes which are really kept as safe deposit boxes for the rich while they go up in value. There is no shortage of housing actually in Kensington and Chelsea. It's just in fact it's not used by anyone, a lot of it. So Bob raised this question that John McDonnell actually coined the phrase in relation to this, that this was social murder. And all the respectable press say, oh, you can't say that was terrible to say. But I think it is quite clearly true. It's obviously a phrase, by the way, that was coined by Engels in the past to describe the conditions and the effect of the conditions in the 19th century in Britain. And actually, it does apply. It's a very powerful phrase to apply now, because this was not an accident. This was a predictable and predicted consequence of a whole series of measures of austerity and neoliberalism. It's a natural product of it. And I think one of the points to take from that is it happened that it took place in a Tory council in Grenfell Tower, but there's actually tower blocks in Camden here and all over the country where it could happen, and those risks still exist. And that's how we can take that issue up and campaign on that should be a key subject for discussion. Now, a lot of the warnings are sort of common knowledge, so I won't draw them out too much, but it is just striking to run through the point. I mean, the first point to say is that you can read the blog from the tenants activist group, which precisely warned that they've been protesting about the lack of maintenance, poor maintenance, and the fire risk that resulted from that. And they actually say in their blog from, I think it was November last year, that it seems that the landlord will only take notice when there's a disaster and there's a catastrophe. Well, they probably didn't quite realise the scale of the catastrophe that there was, but it was very precisely predicted by the tenants themselves. And if you run through some of the warnings, there was the Lacanal fire in Southwark in 2009, and the report from that fire clearly recommended the installation of sprinklers in tower blocks. And I think now about 2% of tower blocks in Britain have sprinklers. And, where's the action on that? That's something we can come back to. But it's worth noting that one of the reasons why no action was taken is that there was a report produced by one of the kind of professional bodies, headed by a guy called Sir Ken Knight, and they couldn't refute the case for sprinklers, but they concluded that it was economically unrealistic. In other words, it would save lives, but I don't recommend spending the money to save the lives. By the way, Sir Ken Knight, and don't doubt is technically very able, is the technical advisor for the independent inquiry that's supposed to be looking into who's responsible. So presumably he's going to be saying, oh well, that advice that said this was economically unviable is responsible. I mean, that's just I probably don't have time to go into it, but that inquiry has all the hallmarks, as well as its narrow terms of reference that try and exclude the political and the wider issues. Actually, it has all the hallmarks of being set up as a cover-up, and we need to discuss later how we take that up. The whole issue of the cladding, which was what probably got the top coverage at first, there was a clear recommendation that all the guidance was unclear, really, from the Lacanal fire, and the government, even with pressure actually from some right-wing Tory MPs, consistently backtracked and pushed that off the agenda, and to this date, that they now have launched a consultation on improving the building regs. But what that meant is the building regs were, that the actual inquiry stated they were incomprehensible, which obviously allowed you know, anyone that wanted to cut corners to find a suitable interpretation of the incomprehensible regulations and install anything, you know, that they wanted. And of course, the last housing minister that was responsible for that is now Theresa May's chief of staff in the Cabinet Office, and it was the Cabinet Office that set up the inquiry. So how independent anyone could see that inquiry of is definitely subject to question. You could go on and on. The decline in the number of fire inspections, but also the decline in the number of building inspections, I think down by about 30 or 40% to ensure that the regulations are being enforced. Cuts in the fire service, and you know, the National Audit Office report that between 2011 and 2016 there was between a 26 and 39% cut in funding for the fire services, and that did have an impact. You know, the FBU have made some statements, and it will no doubt come out further, about the time it took for resources to arrive, but also about the availability of tall ladders and so on. But actually they make the point that there is nowhere else in the country which would have had as good resources as that had. So any other tower block fire outside of London would have been far more difficult to provide resources. And there's the question of the cuts to the ambulance services, the rundown of local hospitals and so on. There's also the question of the change in the nature of housing management, which is partly about the general cuts in housing management and the outsourcing, who's responsible for what and so on. But it's also about the change in the role they give to housing management. And there's actually our branch did not organise KCTMO in the landlord, but there was a very good article in The Guardian by someone who did work in that estate, and she probably speaks for a lot of other housing managers. And she actually says that the reason she left was that she had nightmares about fires in those blocks. You know, and she describes how the nature of the cuts, the way your job is changed because you're supposed to be checking up on people's ID, because you're checking up on immigration status and so on, which takes you away from the ABC fire and safety issues. And she describes this key meeting when tenants were raising questions of fire safety, and the management were repeating the advice: you have to stay put, you have to stay in your flat because you'll have an hour or so's safe period because of all the fire doors. And she knew that so-called compartmentalisation didn't really exist in that block because of the poor maintenance, because they'd left gaps when they reinstalled plumbing and so on. And that was the point at which she decided she wasn't going to stay. And actually, you have to say, we'd had really good trade union organisation in that place and been able to insist on health and safety. Maybe those sort of abuses wouldn't have been possible. And then there's the whole issue of housing regulation, and I think that there may be other people in the room who can say a bit more about that. But I mean, there is a general point that when the Tories came in, it was announced that the social housing regulator was toast. And actually they announced that without even telling the management of the social housing regulator. That was just announced. We still have a social housing regulator, but the reason really was that the banks, the lenders, panicked, and they put enormous pressure, because half the reason, in fact more than half the reason, for keeping the housing regulator from their point of view is to protect huge investments that the banks are making. That's the real point. So that's the function that the housing regulator has been left to play. Now I think there'll be controversy and exposés of the role of the housing regulator, the fact that they didn't pick this up, the fact there's board members there's a board member who was a board member of both KCTMO and the HCA. I don't think he's publicly resigned as yet or gone. So, you know, that remains. But obviously we would make the point that that wasn't due to the conscious decisions or whatever of the workers, the staff involved in the regulator. That was a result of government policy. You have to point, and this bonfire of regulations. So that was the sort of some of the entirely clear indicators of the risk. But those risks exist now, as I said, all around the country in blocks. In some cases, not just cladding, but the I mean, there's a compartmentalisation not being maintained, so there's the Ledbury estate, where there was gaps where you can put your hand through to the other flat. Well, that's no point having a fire door where you've got that, is there really? It's completely, that's a Labour council, we have to say. Here in Camden, actually immediately after the Grenfell fire, in contrast to K&C, they moved in to an estate with a row of tower blocks and decanted it, moved everyone out because of the multiple fire risks, actually, including I think about 1,000 fire doors missing off the estate. But I mean, firstly, how did that happen ever? But actually, the records show that the council knew about that for years. So, you know, when they talk about these, you know, politicians always like to talk about, we make the tough choices, don't they? And what they mean is the tough choices that could result in you dying, but us balancing the books. That's really what it comes down to. Now, there's a whole further, you know, hour of examples you could give around the country. But I think what the point is, there's certain basic demands that tenants you would think would have that could be met easily. And one is to see the fire assessment on your estate. Yeah, actually, landlords, social landlords, both housing associations and councils, are in many cases putting the brakes on that and not sharing them. And I think that's a basic demand. You know, if they're not sharing them because there's no problem and it's fine, well, why would you do that? If they're not sharing them because they show there are problems, or because they've not really been reviewed for years, then you have a right to know that. And I think that should be a key issue that we highlight and raise. And actually, because of the pressure, there has been a build-up of pressure on that. Last week, DCLG, which is the department responsible, actually recommended that there should be proactive sharing of these you know, regulations, these assessments with residents in the local areas. And that doesn't mean it will automatically happen, though, which is why we do need to campaign to take that up. And it's particularly acute. The trade magazine, Inside Housing, for the sector, usually doesn't like to upset the sector because, after all, it relies on job adverts and so on. And about 3 weeks ago, they've been saying you should share this, and they asked all housing associations to share their risk assessments, and they'd put them up on their website. And actually, hardly any have. And of course, they're not. Whereas local authorities, in the end, you can do a freedom of information request. Actually, that's not true with housing associations. They can just completely ignore it. And you know, there's absolutely no doubt that there are problems in housing association tower blocks. That's quite clear. That is a matter of public record. And so I think that's another issue that Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour movement should fight on. And it's another issue that illustrates how the issues around Grenfell do encapsulate you know, the wider problems of neoliberalism and the wider political questions, because what it reflects is the rundown of social housing, cuts over years and years and years, outsourcing, unaccountable housing associations who really run for the interests of the banks, and that is a profound issue that is summed up in the deaths from fire risk, but actually affects the lives of working class people more widely. Now, the government, although in the immediate aftermath of Grenfell, said, you know, money's no object, safety must come first. They've actually come through with no money whatsoever for retrofitting fire extinguishers, which is absolutely not the whole story, actually, in terms of fire safety, but it is a key demand that we can fight for. And by the way, how do they get that? From what evidence do they get that view that fire extinguishers, it's not an essential issue? Because what they say is it's not an essential issue. You can choose to do it, you can not choose to do it. The fire brigade nationally say it is an essential issue. So on what basis do they say the fire brigade are wrong? That really ought to be an issue for this inquiry to investigate. But let's see if it does. But this week it's a very, very good move that Jeremy Corbyn has said, has committed Labour to put the money forward to retrofit fire extinguishers. But I think that's great, and we should support that. But the demand should be, that means there's absolutely no reason to drag your feet now. You shouldn't wait with people, you know, lives at risk for a Labour government before you start spending the money. They should spend the money now and build a government. And actually, it'd be very difficult for the government to refuse that. That's particularly Labour councils, obviously. Actually, in the case of housing associations, the truth is they do have the money. I mean, it's been my hobby horse, but last year the staff costs for housing associations went down 6.6%, which is why there's not enough people doing housing management, doing repairs and so on. Their surpluses went up over 15%, and the average margin for housing associations is about 30%. And to give a sense of what that means, Bovis Homes, the private developer, just last week or the week before, produced their results, and they were boasting at a record margin, the highest margin they've ever achieved, 22.5%. So social housing is quite a good business to be in, as long as you don't have to provide people with sprinklers, basically.
Any services.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Paul. Right, now over to Nancy.
Yeah. Well, as Bob said, we've had to alter a little bit this meeting because we did expect Stuart from the estate that Grenfell is on to come along and speak. And I think that it shows the sensitivity that we approach this tragedy, that we wanted the voice of those concerns to be heard first of all in this discussion. We're living through deliberate political policies which are engineered to create scarcity, to keep prices high, to make people feel insecure in whatever housing situation they find themselves in, from mortgages to rents to council, to keep them feeling like a hen on a hot brick, if you like, insecure in their workplace, insecure on their estate, insecure in their job. And we discussed the situations today of Grenfell in particular, that these deliberate housing policies that have created insecurity led directly to the murders that took place at Grenfell. At a recent housing meeting, someone said, if you laid out all the research papers, all the books, all the theses that have been written to describe how profound this crisis is in housing, you could actually build a house. In the sense that you could probably build an estate. In the sense that we all know what the problem is. You know, the academics are writing about it. You know, the inquiry will probably produce tomes of paper out of it. We know what the problem is, but we need to discuss what our programme is to solve this problem. You've all been put on your seats, we've put a leaflet, which is basically the general programme of the Socialist Party as regarding housing. And really, what maybe distinguishes us from other organisations is we want to solve this problem today. We want it solved now. We don't want to be fobbed off with excuses that we need to wait until 2022. And I'd like to concentrate on 5 aspects covered in that leaflet. First of all, I'd like to talk about the question of council housing, the rehabilitation and the necessity of building millions, renovating and building millions of council housing. Because council housing wasn't won in a slow, ponderous fashion, as some would have us believe. We won that almost in an instant as a response to an emergency, much like we're living through today. From 1945 to 1951, we built 1.5 million council houses. We constructed 150,000 prefabs. Now, prefabs are close to my heart because my gran lived in a prefab after the Second World War. And, you know, I actually believe, as a temporary form of housing, they would immediately solve some of our problems. She speaks about it like she lived in, you know, she was like the landed gentry. She had land round her prefab, and she was very sentimental about her prefab. Now, last year, a couple of years ago, I went away and I stayed in a beautiful house in France. I mean, it was beautiful. And I remember knocking the walls and thinking they're a bit hollow. And we found out it was a flat-packed house that had come from Sweden. And it was glorious, this house. And it gave you a glimpse of the new materials that are available to take the homeless off the streets today and house them, even if it was temporarily for 10 years. Councils, after the last war, compulsory purchased hundreds, if not thousands, of housing. I mean, psychologically, all that discussion that went on around Grenfell about you know, the patronising attitude towards people who lived in, I hate the term council housing, social housing. They were living in council housing, and there's nothing wrong with having a council house. But after the last war, thousands of council houses were compulsorily purchased in streets. If you go to fashionable Islington, I grew up in Islington, and my friend was one of 5 children, and her dad was a postman, and her mum was a dinner lady, and they lived in an Edwardian house in Islington. It's probably worth about £1.5 million today. That's why pay to stay was introduced for people like my friend. They didn't want working class people owning houses, and we have to say we had them once through council housing in streets, and we can have them again because, as Paul said, there's something like 60,000 empty properties in London alone. I think it's something like 5% of all housing in London is empty or second properties. A socialist government worth its salt would be immediately moving to acquire those properties, much like Jeremy Corbyn said in the aftermath of Grenfell, when he said about empty properties being used to house Grenfell survivors. Actually, everybody was in London was like, yes, because we've got the sentiment now in London of second homes and empty properties, and then hundreds, if not thousands, of people sleeping on the streets. In the aftermath of the Second World War, what you saw through the housing struggle was a layer of activists who emerged from that struggle, became radical councillors, became advocates. They had a strong voice, and they didn't cower, if you like. They took their place politically. And people say to us, don't they? They say, oh, you know, Nancy, that was a long time ago. We won those things, council housing, etc. We won those rights a long time ago. And I say, no, but we did it. We did it recently, and we did do it. We did it in Liverpool. We did it in similar circumstances today, and I'm glad Harry's in the room. I think I saw him come into the room, 47 councillor, yeah, because we stand on the shoulders of people like Harry, because similar to today, Thatcher was in power, we had austerity, we were encircled by a hostile right-wing media, we had the right wing in the Labour Party stabbing us in the back, much like the Blairites are attacking Corbyn today, and we built 4,800 council houses with front and back gardens. We renovated 7,400 properties, and we employed 16,000 people in building works. We did that under a state of siege by basically the whole of society, much like we felt recently around Corbyn being under a state of siege. And that was possible because it was led by us, and we had the political will to see that through. Now, the other side of the equation is, firstly, to solve the problem is council housing. The other side is to address the whole question of the private rented sector. Now, 4 years ago, we stood in Waltham Forest on the question of rent control, and we were like laughed out of some of the meetings. People said to us, "We'll never get that. That's a apparition as well." Now, in Labour Party meetings, Corbyn stood up and called for it. It's common currency. It's in the language of housing now. And once again, I'm a child of rent control. I grew up in Islington. I was born in the house I lived in. It was a Victorian basement flat. We were private tenants, and we had rent control. We had secure tenancies. We couldn't be forced out. Every time they tried to put the rent up, my mum and dad, curiously enough, went to the rent tribunal and challenged the rent going up, and we, on a number of occasions, we won. Now contrast that to my children. My son paid more for his student accommodation room than I pay for my housing association house. That's how far things have gone backwards. So the call for rent control now, it's possible to write it into the licensing of landlords, is something that will be crucial to solve the problem of housing. Council housing, rent control, secure tenancies, regulate the private rented sector. Now, how do we get there? What tactics do we use to get there? Now, the Socialist Party has set up a website called Can't Pay, Won't Move. We can't pay and we won't move, because they're the two features that are expressing themselves in some of the struggles that are taking place. We've had New Era, which many people remember was associated with Russell Brand in particular. That was leading towards possibly a section of the tenants not paying the increases and potentially not moving. In Focus E15, the young mums who were threatened with eviction, that was not moving. They were basically occupying that hostel, and they scored a victory by being a significant minority, an intransigent significant minority we call it, of not moving, and they scored a victory. We led the struggle in Butterfield. For anyone who hasn't read the pamphlet, I'd just like to model it quickly. It's available for £2. We led the struggle in Butterfield, and that was around the question of not moving in order to force the concessions from the landlord, and we won. We won. It was a tremendous victory, really. We won that victory. And then we've had One Housing. One Housing was the struggle that took place last year, where the tenants actually were moving towards not paying. So not paying the increases and not moving. And I think those two, we can't force that strategy on the housing movement. There's definitely a housing movement that's already underway and developing, but we would offer those tactics as tactics that can be taken up to score victories while we're campaigning to have the political victories, if you like. Just on, last year, I live in a housing association estate, and the little road was plunged into darkness, because, as Paul said, they outsourced all the maintenance and they don't replace the lights in the road. And we've got nurses who work in the road who come back late at night who are scared. So we formed ourselves we've got a tenants association, housing association, tenants association. And we were asking nicely, we were advocating, and then we wrote a letter implicit in it that we wouldn't pay the service charge. And magically the lights came on because we threatened them in their pockets. So we're saying these two strategies of not paying and not moving, suggestions we're making to the movement to be taken up. We can't force them on people, but we suggest that they're tactics that could extract some minor victories or major victories in the general political struggle. And then my last point really is the Socialist Party is associated with the tactic of challenging electorally the right wing, especially in the Labour councillors who are carrying out social cleansing and who are carrying out gentrification. And we would still encourage housing activists to consider this in their armoury in the fight against right-wing Labour councils. Because, Paul spoke at a recent meeting recently about what's going on in Haringey with the Haringey development vehicle, where you've got a big Corbynista Labour Party, you've got a right wing, and there's this dilemma about whether activists should, there's a fight going on inside the Labour Party, and should activists be standing in those areas? Obviously, we have to treat it very sensitively, but the bottom line is people are going to lose their homes. I'm sorry if you're worried about your political careers as a Labour councillor, but the bottom line is Broadwater Farm Estate, which is a predominantly West Indian black estate and has a strong sense of community, people are going to be forced out of their homes. People are being forced out of their homes all across London. It's being called the London clearances to echo what happened in the Highlands of Scotland. And it is a political issue that we have to weigh up, but there is a growing feeling that we have to resist in whatever way we can. And I'd just like to finish by saying that, you know, people used to say to the younger generation, if you work hard, you know, you can own your own house and you can get on. And I say to my kids, you will never get on unless you get political. You've got to get political, and you've got to fight on the small issues and on the bigger issues. If you're not a member of ours, join us, because we've proved, even in difficult circumstances, we can score victories and fight for the working class.